Welcome back after the break. So we just discussed climatology section that we can expect in your Mapwork paper. But let's just go and have a look at the type of questions that you might expect in your Mapwork paper regarding geomorphology. Now, if you can remember, when we looked at geomorphology, we looked at the different rivers, we looked at the river profile and the underlying rock. Now, if you look at the pole map, for example, you will see that geomorphology, fluvial geomorphology, is all over the place. We have our different dams and our different rivers, as you can see. And we got our different drainage patterns. Okay, before grade 12, you only knew about non-perennial perennial rivers, but today you know about permanent rivers, exotic rivers, periodic rivers, and episodic rivers. So we can take some reference from the map when we see it. And we can go and have a look at the different types of drainage patterns that we see on a topographical map and be able to know the characteristics. So let's just quickly look at some of the questions that you might expect. Now this is quite a very popular question. In which direction does the river flow? Now this is quite simple law of physics. Water can't move from a low-lying area to a high-lying area. Because of gravity, water flows downwards. Now the best and easier way to determine in which direction is a river flowing, let's go to the Berg River. It's very simple. Let's quickly look at this area over there. If you look at this area on your topographical map, you can see that there's a river flowing over there. And as you can see, look at the spot height, 591. There's a trick beacon, 612. Now what happens if we continue moving into this direction? The height is decreasing. So what can we say? If you look at this river, in what direction is it flowing? It's flowing in a westerly direction, because the river is flowing from a high-lying area to a low-lying area. It can't flow upwards. So that's your tip. If they ask you in the question paper, in what direction is the Berg River flowing? You go to the point where you can see the Berg River starting until the final point. You're just going to look at the contour lines. And where the highest contour line is, that's probably where it's flowing from, because it's flowing downwards. Okay, let's just quickly look what the slide says. A river can only flow downhill. So it flows from the highest point to the lowest point. Now we've learned about this in our theory section. I mean, the river starts from its source, high-lying area. There's your upper, middle, and lower course. If you look at your upper course, very steep. What do we experience? Vertical erosion. Middle course, lateral, and vertical erosion. And if you look at your lower course, it's usually a gentle flat area and no erosion is taking place, only deposition. Now another tip that we can have a look at is the tributaries that joins the main river. It's the direction in which the tributaries join the main river, and it will eventually flow with the main river. Okay. Now very importantly over here, identify the drainage pattern of the river. Determine the pattern of the river system as is a dendritic, radial, or trellis. Now we've looked at this during your theory section. Now dendritic resembles the branches of a tree. Okay, and then once again we had to look at the underlying rock. It's very similar, it's the same difference, it's homogeneous, the same underlying rock, because there's the same amount of erosion taking place wherever the river flows. If we look at our trellis pattern, it's usually parallel with one another, two streams, and they join at acute 90 degrees angles. And the reason why this formation takes place because it's heterogeneous rock. It's different types of underlying rock. Some of the rock is more prone to erosion than the other rock. So we got hard rock and soft rock. And lastly, we got a radial pattern. It's flowing in an outwards direction, usually from a high-lying area. Okay, I hope you can remember this. Now let's just quickly look at our map. Now, as you can see, I've spotted some there's a dendritic pattern over there. As you can see, it resembles the branches of the tree. There you can see the dendritic pattern. And then you need to be able to give characteristics of it. Now, if you can see this dendritic pattern, is probably because of the underlying rock is the same. Okay. High-lying areas, we might experience trellis patterns, but in this area over here, we might experience a radial pattern because it's flowing from a high-lying area to a low-lying area. Okay, let's just quickly have a look at another question that you might expect. Determine the underlying rock structure of the area. Determine the drainage pattern in the area. So we just did that. Is it a trellis pattern? Is it a dendritic pattern? Or is it a radial pattern? What causes the drainage pattern? Now that's the underlying rock. For instance, igneous rock is exactly the same, or metamorphic rock. For in the case of pole, because in grade 11 you looked at the pole structure, the batholith that's being exposed is usually igneous rock. And that's the reason, if you looked on the map, that we do find many dendritic patterns on the pole map. Now, the next question, now this is an interesting question. On which stage courses the river? Now that's quite easy to determine. If we look, remember our stages, that's a perfectly longitudinal profile, concave slope, there's the source, and there's the mouth. Now once again we look at the characteristics. If we're going to see the river on a steep contour line. So if I can go and fill in contour lines on our longitudinal profile, now keep in mind this is a side profile. Over here the contour lines are going to be very close to one another. And eventually as we continue, what's going to happen with the contour lines? They're going to be further apart because there's a gentle gradient. And eventually where the mouth of the river is, it's going to be far away from one another because it's a flat gradient. And then we need to go and look at certain characteristics of that river as well. I mean, if you look at the river in the lower course, what happens? It starts to meander. It starts to bend. Okay. And you're just going to have a look. First tip is going to have a look at your contour lines. Now, if we go back to our map over here, I'm going to use the Berg River as an example. As you can see, now this Berg River is definitely in the lower course. As you can see, first of all, a very gentle gradient because there's settlement next to it. You can see the farming taking place next to the Berg River. Why? Because it's situated in the floodplain. And what do we know about the floodplain? There's a lot of nutrients over there. It's very fertile soil. That's why the river is situated. But if we move a little bit up, you can see the river starts to twist and turn. That's meandering taking place. Okay. And what do we experience over here? We're experiencing stream braiding. Now we've learned about stream braiding. What happens? It usually happens in the lower course of the river is where deposition takes place. Because what happens in the upper course? Vertical erosion because of the steep gradient. Middle course, other tributaries starts joining. So what do we have? We have more erosion taking place. The river is getting wider and deeper. But what happens in the lower course? We got deposition, as you can see. So the river starts to braid. Deposition takes place, small islands develop in this river course. Look how beautifully the meandering is taking place. There's another example of stream braiding taking place. So immediately you can identify the course of the river. And as I've mentioned, look at the contour lines. Very far from one another because it's a gentle gradient. Okay, let's continue looking at that. Now, before I want to continue with the geographical information system, there's one section that is not in your textbook, but I want to discuss with you, is the settlement issues. Or settlement, how do you be able to identify settlement on a topographical map? Now, as you can see, the map of Pole, if you look at Pole, there's the town Pole. Now, if you look at the surrounding area, it's mostly rural areas. It's a rural area because what type of activities are taking place? Look at it. If you look over here, a lot of farming activities is taking place surrounding the town of Pole. So immediately, what type of settlement is Pole? It's an urban settlement, it's a town, but it's a central place town. What does it do? It provides the surrounding rural areas with goods and services. I mean, if you look at the town of Pole, what do we find? Many churches, quite a few schools. In fact, two of your best schools in South Africa, Pole Gymnasium and Pole Boys regarding rugby, and shops. There's a police station, post offices, etc. But if you look at the street pattern as well, you can identify this is where the CBD of Pole is. You can see that, the buildings and the churches, etc. And if you look at the street pattern, you can immediately see the street pattern and we can identify it as a gridiron street pattern in the CBD of the Pole. Now, once again, the questions that might be asked over here, name the advantages of this type of street pattern. Now, if you look at it, it's easy to find your way around, many one-ways. It can cause traffic problems. That might be a concern as a disadvantage. And we've mentioned before, it's quite a boring type of street pattern. Now, if you continue looking at it, if you look at the settlements, now if you move outside of Pole, most of the farms over here, you can see they are clustered. If you can see the villages over there, and especially if you look next to the river, if you look at the settlements, the farming activities next to the river, the rural settlement will be in linear shape because it's situated next to the river, as well as close to the transport routes. Now, why is it important when they're shaped like that? Is because most of these farming products is perishable. So they need to be able to have access to transport routes to deliver their products to their designations, for instance, for processing, in this case making wine, or to the market, wherever the products needs to go. Now let's continue looking at our notes. At the map, I just want to quickly zoom out here. Okay, it seems to me my map is a bit stuck on the moment. Let's just quickly take a short break, and afterwards we can continue looking at settlements, and then we will continue with GIS.